This is my presentation on Unit 12, Markets, Efficiency, and Public Policy from the Economy 1.0. The main points and key concepts that I want to hit in this presentation are: why do markets fail? What makes a market fail? How does asymmetric information contribute? What does government policy do to markets? And what bargaining solutions are used for markets? We start with what is market failure. A market failure is when markets allocate resources in a Pareto inefficient way. The market allocation of the good is unlikely to be Pareto efficient if the decisions of producers and consumers affect others in ways that they do not adequately take into account. This then leads to external effects or externalities. A positive or negative effect of a production, consumption, or other economic decision of another person or people that is not specified as a benefit or liability in a contract is an external effect. There are negative and positives. So negative external effects are pollution, smoking, and antibody resistance. Positive external effects are education, vaccines, research, and development. A good example I like to use is pollution. When manufacturers or manufacturing companies, they produce their products and then pollutes our air, our clean air, that then turns into bad air that we inhale and then can also get into our water. These affect people outside of the production company, so they're given a negative external effect. The example from Unit 12 that is used is the real-world case of plantations' use of the pesticide chlordicone to control the banana weevil. A banana weevil is a beetle that eats bananas, so this pesticide helps kill them. Before we get into that, we need to know three different things: the MPC, the MEC, and the MSC. The MPC, or your marginal private cost, is the cost for the producer of producing an additional unit of a good, not taking into account any costs its production imposes on others. The marginal external cost is the opposite. It's the cost of producing an additional unit of good, taking into account anyone but the producer. And then your marginal social cost is actually the combination of your marginal external cost and your marginal private cost. This here is a graph that shows all three. So we have our marginal external cost line, this is the orange line. We have our marginal private cost line, or this purple line. And then we have our marginal social cost, or this green line. As shown here, we also have a green shaded area. The shaded area in the figure shows the total cost imposed on fishermen by plantations using weevil kill. Weevil kill is the chemical used, or the pesticide used to kill these beetles. It is the sum of the differences between the marginal social cost and the marginal private cost at each level of production. Next, we have this graph. So we have point A now, which is at 80,000 tons and about $350. And then we see a marginal social cost of $270 here. We also have this point. It's our Pareto efficient allocation point. It is at 38,000 tons and $400. It's Pareto efficient because neither side wants to delegate their actions to move. The example of weevil kill is a great example of private benefits, and they give negative benefits to the environment. They give benefits to the owners that use them because they're able to kill those beetles, but this pesticide gets in the water resources of the other people, so it hurts the people outside of the people involved. How bargaining solutions help market failures: the use of Coshon bargaining. It's an example of private bargaining named after Ronald Coase, who gave the idea that private bargaining might be preferable to dealing with external effects through or without government intervention. His main argument to the government was that two parties to the exchange have more information than the government to implement an efficient outcome for the situation. So, say there's two parties like the fishermen and the producers. They are able to come to an agreement without the government because they know more about what they're doing than the government does. This is very important, as shown on this graph. So we have two shaded areas. This blue triangle here is your loss of profit. This is a negative surplus for the producers. As they move from 80,000 tons to 38,000, it shows the loss of profit that they have. Then we have this green shaded area. This is your social gain from everybody, including producers and everyone else. And then if you take both areas into effect, the blue and the green, it's actually your gain for fishermen entirely with the use of this Pareto efficient point. The Pareto efficient point comes after the use of Coshon bargaining, where both private parties bargained with each other and found out where they both benefit the same way. Now, there is also downsides to Coshon bargaining. One is the implement to collective action. Private bargaining may be impossible if there are many parties on each side of the external effect. We have asymmetric information. One side may know more information about pollution, costs, and more to reach an agreement. Then we have tradability and enforcement. The bargain involves the trading of property rights, and the contract governing the trade must be enforceable. One side may need to know more about one side, like the fishermen may need to know more about the plantation's operations than others are supposed to know. And then, of course, we have limited funds. One side may not have enough money to pay for the other for the deal to come together. Now we have government policy and how they affect markets and market failure. There are three good examples: regulation, taxation, and enforcing compensation. Regulation is the government may put a cap on the amount of production output a factory company can have. Taxation, Pigovian tax, as a good example, it's a tax levied on activities that generate negative external effects so as to correct an inefficient market outcome. And we have enforcing compensation. The policy from the government could be to require one side to compensate for the other side of the deal. These three are all shown in this graph here. So for regulation, we see that from point A, the producers then have to move, beginning capped at 38,000 of that Pareto efficient outcome. Then we have taxation. It's actually a good example of the Pigovian tax, where since they negatively affect the social cost, they now get taxed for that negative benefit of infecting the water, so they have to pay this outcome here. Now their profit max point is moved from here to this P1 point after they're now having to pay the tax. And then for enforcing compensation, where they are enforced to have compensation is now at your profit max point, or your Pareto efficient point. We see that the social cost is $400, the marginal private cost is $295, so the price of the tax is now $105, also known as your marginal external cost. That explains everything else. We have an example of failed government policy. A good example is legal systems do a bad way of serving people that benefit from one thing and give to another. So a good example is I was trained at an old job and then quit for a better job, but I had the skills from my old job. My old job has no way to claim a benefit or compensation from my new job that is then paid for the training. So my old job paid for training, I get trained, I acquire those skills, I then get my new job, and my old job has no way of getting compensation for that. From this occurs a market failure because the external benefits and the cost of my actions aren't owned by anyone, so I can make my own decisions and carry my own skills. We then move on to asymmetric information. Asymmetric information is when someone knows something that others do not. Some examples of market failures involving asymmetric information are moral hazards and adverse selection. Moral hazards are any situation in which one party to an interaction is deciding on an action that affects the profits or well-being of others, but which the affected party cannot control by means of the contract, often because the affected party does not have adequate information on the action. That's a lot of mumbo-jumbo. Here's a better term that I think summarizes it better. It refers to when one party takes on more risk because they do not bear the full consequences of that risk. With moral hazards come hidden actions. Hidden actions occur when some action taken by one party to an exchange is not known or cannot be verified by the other. Hidden actions lead to moral hazards. A good example here is banks and the government. Banks take risk. The banks then do excess risk taking, which then leads to bank losses. The government then has to bail out the banks because they cannot allow them to go bust. And then with the government bailouts, the banks are able to take more risk, and it's just an ongoing cycle. The market failure comes from here. When the banks take so many risks, it leads to a negative externality for taxpayers, and they bear the brunt of the risk the banks take. We then have adverse selection. The problem faced by parties to an exchange in which the terms offered by one party would cause some exchange partners to drop out is adverse selection. These contain hidden attributes. Hidden attributes occur when some attribute of the person, product, or service provided engaging in an exchange is not known to the other parties. A good example of this is the lemon problem. Let's say there are two cars on the same lot, one worth $12,000 and one worth $4,000. Both have different sellers. They gain a surplus if they receive at least half the price of what they're asking for. The problem here is that the buyer does not know what's wrong with these cars, which then implements asymmetric information, because we don't know what the bad qualities of these cars are. Without the information, we then offer $5,000 to each seller. The person that owns a $4,000 car will gladly sell because they are getting more than what they asked for, while the person that sells a $12,000 car will remove themselves from the market, since the $4,000 sale will lower the average price per car. Then, as the average price keeps dropping, more people then fall out of this market. This will then distort the market due to adverse selection, which then leads to a market failure. Now, while these may sound similar, they are different. The difference is the timing of the asymmetric information. In moral hazards, they happen after the deal is already made. In the adverse selection example, this is before even a deal, an offer, or a transaction even occurs, especially in the car example. We don't know what's wrong with the cars, the sellers do, and they already know that before deals even happened, while the buyers do not. Now, markets may sound all great, but they cannot be used for everything. Why is that? Here it is. The reason markets cannot be used for everything is explained by Ronald Coase. He explains the extent of the market is determined by the firm's decision about which components of a product to produce and which ones to buy. The boundaries of this divide between the firm and the market are set by the relative cost of the make it and buy it options, or I like to call it the producer and consumer options. We then move into repugnant markets. Those are markets that sell certain goods like people or vital organs, violate social and ethical norms, and undermine the dignity of those involved. A good example is selling people. Selling people is always regarded as unethical and unlawful because you cannot own a person. What if there was a market where selling people was okay because it was fully voluntary? Well, objection to that could be that it isn't voluntary because they could be forced, they could have their life threatened, they could be poor and needing a cut of whatever is being sold. Another reason could be that putting a price on a person would be a violation to our human dignity and corrupt the attitudes of others that may want to invest in this market. Another example, merit goods. Those are goods and services that should be available to everyone independently of their ability to pay. Examples are emergency health care, the right to an attorney, and primary education. Well, these examples are available to everyone, whether they can pay at that moment in time or not. An example I like to use is the emergency health care example. If there were a market on emergency health care, it would more likely be a high market because it's very important. Then, let's say a low-income family gets into a car crash. They need to be rushed to the hospital. Well, they would have to pay for the ambulance, the health care, and everything. But since it's a higher costing, they can't pay. In many countries, these are considered rights to every citizen. So, that's not an issue here in America, but it could be issues in other countries. When we talk about merit goods, this picture I think provides a great example. We have underconsumed products that have social benefits that are provided by the government. In conclusion, for my presentation, I think that my key concepts and main point slides are all talked about. Talk about why markets fail, we point on what makes the market fail, and we also talk about how asymmetric information, government policy, and bargaining solutions are used in markets and what makes the markets fail from those. Thank you.